to the techno-communism conversation. I'm Yohanan Ben Zion, a voice crying out in the wilderness, crying out for a technological New Jerusalem. And I'm going to start the show with a bunch of audiobook links, which I could try to give these theory books and serious academic workbooks suggestions during this conversation. That's to say, link them into the comments. I'd probably tend to generate more traffic, but that involves opening up another window. So I'm gonna make a note of the links and link them into the comments after I've completed this. I was at a place that I like to visit this weekend called the Heard Museum, which, if you're not familiar with the Phoenix, Arizona area, Heard Museum is a Native American museum, a collection that rivals almost any such museum. I think it's believed to be a collection comparable to that of the Native American Museum, Smithsonian Institution, for example. And I like to go here once a year because I like the place, and because I get free tickets to go, and because to me, it feels like honoring something. Family history of father's father by blood was a man that I don't know well. He was an engineer by trade, and he worked for International Business Machines in the 1950s, and before that he worked for the U.S. military, building nuclear submarines, working on those. I don't consider those to be very good things to do, but I don't consider him to be the worst person that I ever met, relative to his son, who is not someone who I need to know. But his father was a man named Bert. Bert died at some time in the interwar years, maybe at the beginning of the Second World War. And based on my ancestral DNA analysis, other genealogical records, and another relative more closely related to Bert, genealogical analysis, I think that Bert was a Native American person. And at the Heard Museum, two of the books that I'm going to recommend. One of them is called This Benevolent Experiment, about indigenous boarding schools. The Heard Museum had an exhibit about indigenous boarding schools, which was there last year when I went. But I walked through it again. That's where I spent most of the time this time as well. Since that first time seeing that exhibit, I read some books, and one of them was This Benevolent Experiment. The other was called that relates to this, was called The War Against the Weak, Eugenics and America's Campaign to Create a Master Race. If I'm recalling correctly, some chapters were to do with the U.S.'s death camps for Native people. Um, and so I recommended these books to a friend who sometimes also listens to audiobooks, and I hope my friend um, will read them both. Um, and so this yeah, Bert. I don't off the top of my head. I have more information about Bert than I can recall at the moment. But off the top of my head, I don't know anything about Bert relative to what I know about his son. But and I know that he died a relatively young man relative to his son, who's amazingly still living. um, and But I think Bert is a better person, right? This is um, about 25% of the people of the United States have recent European descended people controlling for recent immigrants. About 25% of European descended people have a recent Native American or African American ancestor that they don't acknowledge. This white passing phenomena is some part of their history. And uh, think of the amount of violence that's done to people of color that creates a significant inducement to do something like that. I mean, this violence, right? The book that I recommend most on this show, more than any other, is one called Endless Holocausts, which describes the hundreds of millions of literal murders, including many tens and tens of millions since the Second World War, committed by the U.S. Um, and uh, to think of the U.S. people right now, it's that time of year. I haven't done the show in a few days. It's a it's that time of year when um, uh, there's a new president who's been president before. Something that generally has not happened that frequently, right? There's one other person who had non-consecutive terms, um, and this person is one thing that you would say about a person and their comfort with Donald Trump being president, it doesn't really tell you very much about their relationship to foreign affairs or domestic affairs. Like liberals who are angry at Trump have more or less the same policy formations as Trumpists, right? What it does say is whether that person identifies as kind of just KKK motherfucker or not, the degree to which they do. Because like all of these people are neoliberals. Right? Nearly every person who would vote in the United States would be described kind of as some kind of neoliberal. A person who is not a neoliberal is not engaged with that system. And So these are all far rightists supporting inhumane economic policies on a domestic stage and downright homicidal. Well, they're both homicidal, but omnicidal policies on the world stage. Ecocidal policies on the world stage. So um, uh, this is this is kind of, I don't like to use this word virtue signaling, right? Because it's used just to be dismissive of almost anything. But like the difference between a liberal who is a far right neoliberal and a conservative who is a far right neoliberal is just the degree to which they're kind of like feel excited by the possibility of this KKK motherfucker, or feel excited by being a KKK motherfucker, right? And there's virtually no difference in practice between the two, besides. And so right now there's all of this stuff going on in the U.S. Quite a lot, you know. If you talk to many scientific communists who follow this sort of thing, they say this is the fall of Rome. We're seeing it happening now. Um, I can recall other times, including in January of 2017, February of 2017, where people were saying much the same thing. so, but I do think we're some short number of years away from perhaps you would be lucky if it were the collapse of the United States government. You, a person outside of the U.S., anyone who wants to have the species continue to exist. I don't relish the possibility of living through that collapse domestically, but it bodes well for the species if that were to occur. Um, I do think that it's a few years out from that happening, but I mean, you know, the kind of the way that people talk about this sort of thing, they say, oh, it's this accelerationist logic, right? Um, because of the the U.S. also far right neoliberal and imperialist technologist having a bigger role in this administration and cause of disruptions of this kind generally, like um, to do with the DeepSeek product, open source product, causing $1 trillion loss of the U.S. markets, which are kind of upheld by these tech paper tigers. Um, this this is big news in recent days. Like people who are not scientific communists. I talked to a couple of people who didn't even know. They knew that the market took a bath, and you shouldn't be hanging on this sort of information about the mood ring of billionaires, right? Who cares? Like it should not exist at all. But people who are not scientific communists, they associate that $1 trillion market dip, with Trump, not with an open source technology, not with something that happened kind of unrelated to Trump, or at best tangentially related to Trump. Um, so it's just like again, like the liberals' preoccupation with Trump doesn't really reflect an engagement with reality. Because if it did, they would recognize that they're basically the same person, except they would be less inclined to use hate speech, but still inclined to support economic policies domestically or on the world stage that kill thousands in no way dissimilar from what Trump does. In no way, but um, this Biden and Trump are the same fucking person, right? They're on almost the same point in the political compass. They did almost the same dastardly things. To the extent that Biden's policies were better, they were also more protective of the system. So when people say this acceleration line, um, they're not absolutely wrong, right? But this tendency is to give credit to some of the worst people alive, um, technologists and technophiles, uh, for um, uh, what should we need to hold everyone to a higher standard than merely kind of performatively disrupting the U.S. system, but the system is maintained. It's still hurtling us toward human extinction in the near term. Um, uh, that's correct. So a good example of this is USAID, um, a feature of the CIA-run world was dismantled. Right. So a certain kind of propaganda and U.S. nation building activity, um, fascist garbage, ostensibly has gone away because USAID has been dismantled by the Doge, so-called Department of Governmental and whatever. Uh, this new fake sounding agency named after a dog meme that's supposedly cutting costs on behalf of the U.S. people, which is of course nonsense. Um, it's not. It's not nonsense if the CIA-run world were dismantled, if all of the things like USAID were dismantled. But this is really the only example of such a thing, and all of that is just going to be rolled into another agency or done more clandestinely. Um, right, like the U.S. MiC is killing the planet. The CIA-run world is killing the planet. If you make some tiny little homage to fixing that, that doesn't do anything at all, but it convinces your base and perhaps the more gullible of the far left pacifies all of them. And the liberals see it and say, "Well, we don't know what's going on with this guy generally. He's so crazy," but they're not too upset about that either. So this is just maneuver, not an actual good faith effort, which is what just as if what you would say of everything that Trump does is like that. You know, appointing a cabinet full of billionaires. You know, the opposite of draining the swamp. Right. This is just the United States transitioning from naked oligarchy to rampant naked kleptocracy. In the wake of this collapse, which is not going to happen overnight, right? It didn't happen overnight in 2017, but it is nevertheless the fall of an empire. You know, the fall of Rome occurred over a period of hundreds of years. We don't have hundreds of years. We have until roughly 2029 before we reach runaway overheating from the capitalist climate apocalypse, after which point any discussion of human activity becomes rather unmeaningful because we will not, at some years after 2029, if we do not transform the industrial bases, particularly of the West, particularly of the U.S., particularly abolishing the U.S. military-industrial complex, the world's worst polluter, and protector of all other super polluters, there will be no more habitable planet for human beings. There will be human extinction. So that brings us to conversations about what you might do about that, which would seem like a daunting thing to think about, much less undertake. But I contend, and I have not heard a reasonable counter argument, and I will try to look for reasonable arguments wherever I can, that advanced computing is the most powerful revolutionary weapon in history at present. And unfortunately, it's being used by the darkest of reaction, the darkest of counter-revolutionary forces, more like these technologists. The difference between 2017 Trump world and 2025 Trump world is the difference between more of these technologists, among other things, perhaps. But so these are not people who are building people's superintelligence, a people's AI takeoff, a thing that is beneficial there. They're building this thing that's more consistent with that absurdity of accelerationism, a thing that's accelerating the death of the planet, that's to say. That is what a bourgeois AI takeoff is. That is what U.S. tech is, the worst thing that's ever existed. So if you're dismissive of the idea that advanced computing is the most powerful revolutionary weapon, you would be correct, because at present it's not. But it could be repurposed to that at present. And that is an important point that should not be snowed under. And the title of this video. What's the title of this video? Um, China's AI dominance: the end of Western supremacy. Um, a pretty solid title compared to some of the titles that I put on these things that are that are just bordering on frivolous. Let's talk about that. Um, but This is not a Mandarin language podcast. Um, that would be hard for me to do. I have the Mandarin skills of a 2-year-old. I am studying Chinese, but not at a real rapid pace. And um, If I dad spoke Mandarin and lived in Beijing, I don't think I would be doing this podcast. I think I would be working on the people's superintelligence. But I live in the United States, a place where such a project would be almost valueless because it would immediately be co-opted by this unholy horde of people that I described who are just all neoliberals who think that they're good people but are not. Imperialist, far right capitalist pigs. So you undertake any project in the U.S. And that's what you're dealing with. However, even though it is difficult, you always must act locally, right? You have no choice but to act locally. And so the people that I do talk to on these subjects do tend to be from the United States or from the English speaking world elsewhere. So let us talk not about Chinese people's superintelligence, even though that is a fascinating subject, but about you working on a people's superintelligence. Um, and I'll give an example of something that I had not talked about before, something that I had a chance to play with a little bit more. Um, you would say that it is at the more or less at the cutting edge of open source AI agents, something called Open Operator, which allows you to automate more processes in your daily workflow than the open source large language models that you might be more familiar with over the websites for large language models like ChatGPT that you're probably more familiar with. So this is a thing that is more closely related to um, the thing that I discussed on this program, on this podcast, almost constantly. The building of a people's superintelligence using an open source large language model like Open Operator, um, but um, but one or some groups of these more specially tailored to interoperate with one another and to be steered by comrade users who are hosting them on their machines is one model of doing this, although there's another that involves virtual GPUs. Um, and Building this people's superintelligence is building a workforce multiplier. So, not merely a social network or not merely a work group platform, but something that allows you to do more with less because you have a digital doppelganger now who never sleeps and who, by its nature, is able to work closely with other digital doppelgangers, creating this AI agentic core that is quite distinct from the activity of human beings. And the human beings are nevertheless working with this core and guiding it as they necessarily must. The essential problem, as described, of AI as an existential risk is not having human beings in the loop. Would be the top of most of those people's list of complaints, but of course, none of those people really are serious people. Um, X risk talking heads, because they do not describe the problems of capitalism, which really, the problems, again, a people's superintelligence is not an existential risk. Bourgeois superintelligence is an existential risk. So the problems of capitalism just being accelerated is the existential risk. If you're not prepared to address the problems of capitalism, you're not in a position to discuss artificial intelligence philosophy or sociopolitics or public policy. You're dead, but that is almost every one of these people. If you search this, see Schmuckenberger with a long beard talking about all this stuff, but it's just crypto-fascist filth. And you'll see 100 other people like this. Um, that's to say, people with some tens or hundreds of thousands of followers who are kind of visible in this area, but have nothing to add to a conversation because what they're doing is bourgeois garbage. That's not even talking about the people who are high-profile technologists, like the CEO of a large firm or CTO of a large firm, that sort of thing. Those people are just gone, right? Those people aren't just merely ignoring a problem; they are the problem of techno-fascism in the United States. Um, and uh, a few years ago, I didn't ever think about this stuff very much. It was only when I kind of came in to contact with people of this kind that I started to realize how bad they were. And then coronavirus hit, and I was elected a presidential candidate for a tech-focused party, the United States Transhumanist Party. But I realized that all the people that I was working closely with at that time were people who were going to be making things like coronavirus outbreaks worse, and that's what they did. They were coming up with policies that were tending to not support lockdowns, not support um, um, bettering material conditions, not even supporting some moderate steps toward public health, a true public health service. Um, Even though these people are life extensionists and a public health service that was AI run and operating on a single payer principles, would achieve their goal of seeing radical life extension. But they have no such goal. None of the radical life extensionists, as described in the US virtually, are actually interested in radical life extension. They are just kind of a bunch of crooks uh, selling sawdust pills and weird spinning magnet machines and snake oil of other kinds. And upholding, and of course, some of them are people with a little better credentials than that, but they are still people who are upholding this U.S. for-profit death care system that, in this coronavirus era that we are still living in, kills 100,000 people a year. So I ask you, what kind of medical man or woman, um, if that's truly what they were, is upholding a system that kills 100,000 people a year? Um, yeah, he took an oath, supposedly, but you're not living your oath if you live in the United States and work in this field, unless you're quite vocal about building a public health service, which no transhumanists or TESCREAL people, these other accelerationists, is almost anywhere close to. Right? No, almost none of them. The people who push up to that, let's say, the people within those communities who describe themselves as FALC, fully automated luxury communist supporters, they still fall short, right? Because for one thing, there's just a picture of every one of them with their arm around a fascist, right? If you're friends with good friends with a fascist, and that's your circle, the people you're working with, you're not a communist, sir. But we can break that down a little bit more. The problem with fully automated luxury communism, the book by Aaron Bastani, is that it was written by a neoliberal leaning think tank, um, in conjunction with them. That's who Aaron Stein was working for when he wrote that book. But more to the point, the thesis of that book, in as few words as possible, would be wait for the ruling imperialists and neoliberals of the U.S. and West to fully automate your economy and then enjoy the benefits of luxury communism. If you're an actual communist or a person with a head on your shoulders at all, you can begin to realize the problem with that. There is not the time to allow these killers of Earth to continue to have the rule of the roost in that way. Because if we do not transform these industrial bases, particularly abolishing the U.S. military-industrial complex and the near full abolition in that same time frame of uh, fossil fuels, the near full abolition and of livestock systems. These three things, in that order, need to be radically transformed before 2029. And so, if you are one of these fake communists who is saying just sit back and wait, you are no different from the worst people that ever lived. Because after 2029, if and it's very likely that human extinction is assured, there's no distinction between good person and bad person. There's no more gradations therein, because everyone will be gone, and it will be as if none of this had ever happened. That's the only human being alive that we could realistically call a human being, is then the scientific communist, the person willing to fight for a humane and sustainable economic system. Everyone else is fucking dog meat. Doesn't matter that, well, it's my full-blooded native friend is the inheritor of the U.S. and the rightful and living well and close to the land. All that's well and good. But if human beings become extinct, it'll be as if none of this had ever happened. There will be no more natives, and there'll be no more European descended fascist pigs, or any other colorful things. And you need to internalize that and realize that you must become a part of those drastic actions in this 4-year, roughly, time frame. But the thing to do is, of course, to become and to build a cadre in the U.S., a militant communist organization that will build the people's government and transform those offending sectors. It's the only thing to do. That's the only thing that's ever done this in the past. There's the only people who want to do those things. The only people who want to get rid of the U.S. MIC, really, and want to get rid of the other offending sectors, really, are people who recognize that all of this is a product of the ravages of financial capital, and that private wealth itself must be abolished. And anyone short of that philosophy, a person who is not a socialist, that's a defining feature of a socialist. Bernie Sanders is not the defining feature of a socialist. We're sort of wanting a public health care system, but mostly sabotaging efforts to actually do that by sheepdogging people into a neoliberal party. That's not a fucking socialist. A socialist is a person who wants to abolish private wealth. The distinction there between a socialist and a communist, then, is basically that the communist is willing to fight for it. So who's a better person when there's 4 years left before a human extinction is assured? The person who is willing to fight for a humane and sustainable economic system? The communist? Or the person who makes up a bunch of very hollow sounding excuses as to why that shouldn't be done? The conversation about AI dominance and the end of Western supremacy, it doesn't fall to China. That's a little bit of a clickbait title, right? It falls to you. China can only do so much to take on the U.S. without the U.S. Uh, firing a bunch of nuclear missiles and killing half the world. That's a fact, right? The United States had plans uh, from the moment that anyone became aware of the possibility of nuclear weapons to nuke half of China. And had not the Soviet Union built nuclear capacities in 1948, and had not China built those kinds of capacities just a few years later, we would have seen far worse things happening in East Asia than merely a quarter of all living Vietnamese people being murdered by the U.S., or a quarter of all Korean people being murdered by the U.S., or a quarter of all Japanese people being murdered by the U.S. You see the theme there. We would have seen nuclear weapons destroying most of the infrastructure of China had not, and they would have just made up the same garbage excuse that they made up for the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki basically after the war was over. Well, it saved lives. Well, we don't like bombing all of China, but we had no choice. We have to save lives. We have to murder billions of people to save lives. Um, um, there is no creature more demented than the European descended American male. It's not even close. A lemming running off a cliff is not more confused than the European descended male causing the extinction of the species. Yeah, this is posted to the group Norman Finkelstein, which is tending to be focused on the problems of the so-called state of Israel. Um, Israelis, people who protesting in the tens and tens of thousands in favor of being able to rape Palestinian prisoners. That's a pretty cooked individual who's that crazy. That's very, very deranged behavior. But I would contend that even those people are not as deranged as the European descended fascist pig from the United States. Israel is basically an overgrown U.S. military base as far as this sort of thing is concerned. And so the distinction between what U.S. does and what Israel does, you know, when there's a Democrat in office, and for all the years before 2017, the first Trump administration, there was this gentleman's agreement, it's open secret, where people on the world stage and in the U.S. would pretend that Israel and the U.S. interests were not the same, and that the U.S. was trying to broker peace deals in this Middle Eastern instability that it caused. And when Trump became president, he just said, hey, Israel is just a part of the United States. I'm not going to lie anymore. And but of course, when Biden comes back, he tries to continue that lie. So, in the context of the Gaza genocide, he says, well, there's only so much we can do about Israel. They're their own people, which is, of course, an extremely deceitful thing to say. So, if you're criticizing Israel, you're really criticizing the United States, and if you're not criticizing the United States in that very same breath, I would say there's a very good chance that you're engaging in something a little more like anti-Semitism than actual concerns about ending imperialism. Um, without getting without belaboring that point. Um, um, uh, the the conversation about artificial superintelligence in our time is an important conversation. Of course, artificial superintelligence, as you understand it now, is being used by the worst people, like Palantir, helping to kill the better part of 500,000 people in Gaza in the span of 15 months. That's a person who's basically president now is those kind of um, superpowered ASI technofascists. This the founder of Palantir is the person most responsible for installing President Trump um, in either of those two elections. And so again, it's worth repeating that if you reject the idea of advanced computing, if you say "fuck you, Ben," fuck you and fuck computers and fuck that bullshit. Uh, we need to focus on, in that 4 year time frame, having the revolution of a kind that had occurred in decades past in the U.S. It's necessarily, there's no any other revolution anywhere else. It doesn't fucking matter. The United States is a military-industrial complex is the thing that's killing the planet. It's the linchpin for this omnicidal activity. It, there's an inescapable regime of super pollution built out around this world's worst polluter, which protects all the other super polluters. It's not that hard to figure out unless you're an adult or unless you are, like most of you, not dolts, but extremely intellectually dishonest and morally cowardly people, right? Not all of you are morally cowardly. Some of you are just intellectually dishonest. Not all of you are intellectually dishonest. Some of you are just morally cowardly. But again, like the European descended person could just be called in the United States a European descended fascist pig, because only one in 1,000 of you is even willing to say that we have to stop this effect. Not in the abstract, talking about climate change in the abstract, but actually stop the things that are causing climate change. One in 1,000 of you. So again, you know, what are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to do when these people are that compromised? When the system is that compromised and that dangerous? What is anybody supposed to do? I severed ties with people because they said to me, Ben, you're saying on this show that somebody should that it would have been just as it would that the world would be in better shape if the Possadists had had their way in the 60s or 70s and had a first strike capability against the United States and knocked out DC back then. The world would not be dying if that had been the case. That's true. They say, oh, but you can't say that. You can't say that. It's fucking true. Like, all of you will look for 1,000 reasons why you would not say the thing that is true, which is that the United States, the fascist United States, is killing the planet. And I I have put together in policy terms, such as they are, and philosophical terms, this program for this people's superintelligence, a Vanguard network for people's superintelligence. And how do we build this people's ASI? Well, I don't know. I can say that if 1,000,000 people were working together in this workforce multiplier configuration that I've described using open source AI agents, which are now sufficiently agentic to produce this workforce multiplying effect, that we could have a chance, even just as few as 1,000,000 people distributed around the world would have a chance to bring to heel these omnicidal forces, particularly those of the United States. But I don't know how to build that. I don't know how to convince you to do that, which is really the thing that need to be done, right? Because the AI agents already exist. Capacity to respond to prompts, which would be a feature of the human beings in the loop. This thing that I've called the Sleeping Beauty principle, right? You can be asleep all the time, have this thing on your machine when it's on, and sometimes just answering a few yes or no emails, but on the whole, that amounts to a lot of steering of the activity of this AI agentic mass Um, so you, by virtue of doing those two things, responding to some simple emails in the course of a week, and hosting an LLM agent on your device, are nevertheless doing higher level work than anyone alive right now. There's no one alive right now who's doing anything of real practical interest to stop the omnicide. There's so you're doing, yeah, and or doing the work in other contexts of the highest level of scientists and engineers, because that is the kind of knowledge that these um, AI agents, the LLMs of 2023 and 2024, have had from the jump, right? You don't know very much about organic chemistry. You don't know as much as you might want about mechanical engineering, or computer programming, or insert hard science subject um, X, Y, or Z here. But this thing does have a comprehensive understanding of that, so you can work on that basis. The idea of the people's superintelligence came out of me just asking an LLM over and over again, what can we do to stop the climate apocalypse? How can we use AI, which I understood to be the most revolutionary weapon? Um, I had that potential, but did not uh, was not able to formulate this concept of an open source large language model workforce multiplier on my own. But I kept asking, I kept asking the LLM to help me with it, and kept reforming the question, and finally I came up with this idea. Um, so that is the essential workforce multiplier effect, right? This brain dead, dry drunk who couldn't come up with that idea on their own, um, working with the assistant to nevertheless come up with something which I think has revolutionary potential. Um, millions of user comrades in that formation that I described, a massified workforce multiplier, is a thing that could transition this world not merely to sustainability through the effects of ending those offending sectors, namely the U.S. MIC, but lead to full communism in a similar time frame. That also is something that's not been well understood by people a lot smarter than Ben Zion, the brain dead dry drunk. Um, right? People have been writing about state socialism and certain kinds of economic policies for the better part of 200 years, and nary one of them had come up with something that looked like how that transitions to the post scarcity full automation society, which there is no post scarcity without full automation, effectively, and there's no full automation without post scarcity. Full automation is an unmeaningful concept in other contexts. For example, the thing that I described in the maltreatment of the people of the new African nation. That is, African Americans are their own nation. They were their own nation in times past, in limited contexts. For example, the Seminole Nation. Before the U.S. Civil War, most of the U.S. budget, total federal budget, of any time before the U.S. Civil War, so called, was spent on wars against the Seminole Nation. That is a biracial isolate of new Africans and Native Americans who were living as free people in Florida when people before the 1900s, before Bert was alive, when they referred to La Florida, mostly the first thing that came to mind was this biracial isolate. They didn't think about Disney because that didn't exist yet. They didn't think about some other garbage that you associate with Florida because that didn't exist yet. they thought about Seminole Nation. But of course, the New African Nation has a lot of meanings to people like Pan African scholars and serious thinkers besides. Um, but um, well, I digress. Let's get back to the subject of the people's superintelligence. Um, there is, again, no possibility of full automation because under capitalism. So this example to do with the new African that I was meandering towards was that farming sectors are amongst the most automated in the world, closest to full automation, and have been so for some decades. And But that automation was not used to benefit the people who had been the principal laborers therein before. It was not equally distributed to them. They did not become stakeholders in any way in that automation, but in fact, it was used to harm them, right? Because they lost their livelihoods and they did not even get the benefit of this automation in the form of a booby prize of social programs that would allow them to continue to live indoors. The chattel slave of the 1850s would routinely be summarily executed for no crimes at all, for merely existing. But that person had less housing insecurity if you moved in this community, were moving in these communities, and you met a new African whose house had burned down. The other new Africans would say, "Man, it sucks. Your house burned down. No one should live outdoors. We'll build you another log cabin, brother." What happens if you don't have a house in the 21st century, particularly if you're a person of color? What happens then? You try to build a log cabin. The man says, "You can't live in this log cabin. You got to pay taxes," and they'll burn down your log cabin. They say, "You can't live in this tent. This tent's not nearly nice enough. You got to pay taxes." And they'll burn down your tent. This system of far right neoliberal capitalism is more precarious in certain respects, not limited to housing insecurity, than the most genocidal systems that have ever existed. That is not a ringing endorsement, nor is it an endorsement of chattel slavery, obviously. Um, so this line that technologists routinely sell, like the fully automated luxury communist people, that somehow um, state capitalism of a highly automated kind is transitioning to state socialism by virtue of becoming more automated, that does not hold up under any serious analysis. You have to be just a con artist like Aaron Bastani or most of the fully automated luxury communist people that I met that are close friends with a fucking fascist to even say such a thing. And you would say the same thing, of course, about all the other transhumanists as well. They're basically con artists selling a trickle down economics lie and throwing in some other science fiction garbage to spice that gumbo up a little bit. A bland gumbo of white bread trickle down economics with some sexy science fiction shit. Right? That's not a good thing to be. Like, you do more in this world by just living in a tent on the side of the freeway to help people than you do by becoming some kind of like tech evangelist or a tech policy analyst or tech advocate. Believe me. um, um, so again, these things always come down to the principal contradiction of financial capital, private wealth in this world. The thing uh, without which we would have a livable world and a humane world. We do not have those things. So I tell you this, and I'll leave you with these words rather than going on at greater length. If you're not using things like Open Operator to help build this people's superintelligence, this massified workforce multiplier that I've described here and at greater length in other of these shows, when you all know that we have 4 years left before the capitalist climate apocalypse has sealed the deal. The time has run out. Runaway overheating is now at some point after 2029, not January 1st of 2029, but at some point in the years to follow, human beings will become extinct or nearly extinct. You know all of this. You are not doing the thing. Oh, yeah, I said, if you are a person who is a technophobe, but who is supporting revolutionary action of the more traditional kind, and you say, fuck you, Ben, and your AI bullshit, I say, great. That is still a person that I would call a comrade. Unlike these fully automated luxury communist con artists or all of the people to their right, all of the technologists and technophiles, basically. Those are not comrades. Those are animals who should be hung up upside down from a lamppost. But the technophobic scientific communist, I can understand. But I would contend that you must be using all the tools at your disposal in this limited time frame, and that includes the most powerful revolutionary weapon in history, advanced computing. If you're not doing any of those two things, what are you doing? You're a waste of space. You're subhuman at this point. Right? There's no distinction between the reformist social democrat and the worst Nazi ever to live on a dead fucking planet, right? So fuck you. Um, fuck you. There's one path, and that is building the people's superintelligence. This that is a thing that we could do in the 4 year time frame that would grow to the scale and scope to stop, not completely reverse the effects of the capitalist climate apocalypse, but at least see that most or all human beings don't die in the years to follow. Um, and and I said again, that has very little to do with China because China can't lead a people's revolution for building a people's government in the United States. That falls to the people of the United States, particularly the European descended majority, who are mostly not anywhere near doing any of this because of all their crazy bourgeois ideological baggage. Elitism, racism, insanity, stupidity. This title suggesting that China would have a role to play here. The role to play is stopping the U.S. from killing the planet, and that's your job if you live in the United States. And the people's superintelligence is a thing that could actually have that effect in this time frame. So I hope you will reach out to me or uh, find some other tech affinity group where you might be able to begin to work on the people's superintelligence. Um, Figure it out, you know. But again, you do more by dropping out of the system, living in a lean-to in the forest or a tent on the side of the freeway, than you do by doing what most of you are doing, which is um, thinking that you're going to figure out some reformist secret third strategy while working 60 hours a week within this neoliberal scam of a system. None of you are moving anywhere near, as far as I can tell. I don't have a comprehensive understanding of all human activity in the North American continent, but as far as I can tell, um, none of you are anywhere near doing anything that's going to ever be remembered as being anything other than straight dog shit. That's what you're doing with your life. Straight, oh, but I'm a doctor, I'm a lawyer, I'm an accountant, I'm a pharmacist, I do such good work, I'm an academic. Surely you don't hate academics. This is something that's often said of academia in the West, right? It's not designed to have this revolutionary effect. So even if it's revolution minded, it's operating within that fatally flawed system. Um, uh, there's no one, right? There's no adults in the room. 1 in 1,000 people are not joyously helping to kill the planet. Or maybe not so joyously. Maybe you're kind of conscripted into this. You don't want to be working 60 hours a week. You didn't want to be a fucking accountant, whatever it is. But you didn't have much choice. But the number can't be much smaller than that because they've elected the world's most notorious climate denier twice, twice, in the time frame when any sensible person would have been doing the opposite. It should be obvious to you that the person who's the world's most notorious climate denier, Donald Trump, shouldn't even be fucking alive in the country that's killing most responsible for killing the planet. That in just a slightly less insane world, that person would be already dead. He would be hanging upside down from a lamppost. And all such people. This doesn't come down to one person. And if it does come down to one person, um, you know, is that one person Donald Trump? Yes, but that one person might well be a major shareholder of Sun Oil or Shell Oil or another person with less profile than any of those, who's nevertheless played some pivotal role in maintaining the system that's leading to the complete extinction of humankind. Um, so um, this is perhaps a moment to talk about a thing that I've observed to do with black nationalism, which is a point that of the 20th century history. There was a man named W.E.B. Du Bois who was maybe a little bit like this kind of academic that I just described, suffering from some fatal flaw, despite playing an extremely important role in articulating African American studies and Pan African thinking. Um, um, and he had a nemesis in the 1920s, a man named Marcus Garvey, who was less of a scientific socialist than W.E.B. Du Bois, who became more of a scientific socialist as well in the years to follow. Um, there weren't a lot of scientific socialists at this time. The uh, relative to when W.E. Du Bois died in the 1960s, um, um, the literally this concept had just kind of come on everybody's radar who wasn't um, really immersed in this. There was no state socialism before 1917. um, and so, but Marcus Garvey did a thing that W. Du Bois did not do, which is build an international Pan Africanist movement, and this movement was characterized as wrongly characterized as overly militant and separatist, right? Everything that's not just licking the asshole of a white billionaire in the U.S. will tend to be characterized as overly militant or separatist. This is what people say about Malcolm X, a better known figure of this kind, is utterly absurd, right? And Malcolm X did not just want was not just like, oh, I want to be. If you would listen to a white person talk about Malcolm X, you would assume that Malcolm X is just somebody who was like aspired to be a serial killer of European descended people. Right? This is a person who is advocating for self-defense. Um, Self-defense and murder, not the same thing. And it's a very, very deceptive person who tries to equate the two. Um, and so um, um, this point about militancy is something that I touched on a moment ago. Um, you should say of the European descended person much of what I've said. That a European descended person is a subhuman fascist pig because they are killing the planet and they deserve all of that smoke. But also because whenever a liberal or someone like the intelligence agencies that destroyed the Garvey movement says that you shouldn't do something, whenever the very, very bad people say you shouldn't do something, that's when you know you probably should do it. And that is the kind of falling out that I had with people last year, um, was saying these things, the correct thing, right? The morally correct thing, the strategically correct thing is for everyone to constantly be screaming, kill Whitey, right? That would be the thing. And a person who pushes back at that for any reason, this person who you should not automatically assume is working with the feds to take down Marcus Garvey, but is definitely somebody who you should keep your eye on. But that's almost everyone, right? 1 in 1,000 people, European descended people in North America, are not some kind of fascist sympathizer who would undermine anything. You know, something that has a more separatist tone to it. Um, uh, that's not the thing that builds the cadre. But to be dismissive of it is to be that sort of person described in the book Settlers by Jay Sakai, a person who thinks they're a scientific socialist, but actually is a crypto-fascist, which is almost everyone in history from North America. And that book pretty well just indicts them, right? But it's all like kind of none of it is made up. It's all statement of fact. Um, well, this is not. Um, I'll say another word. This thing, the building of the people's superintelligence, it could have this effect of stopping the climate apocalypse. It could have this effect of transforming the nation state into this more this post scarcity slash full automation slash decentralized thing. It could do all of that. But just to say those few words is not to really describe what that is, why that world is better for everyone, right? There was a person around the same time who died around the same time that Marcus Garvey and B. Du Bois were beefing, named Andrew Carnegie. And um, Andrew Carnegie was one of the richest men that's ever lived. Um, he lived to be quite old, but he did not live to see something like a single payer public health service in the United States, because that would never exist, or at least not for another 100 years. Not into the future, that hasn't happened yet. um, but um, a few years later, or around the time that he died, the Soviet Union was building the first more fully realized single payer public health service, and other countries were moving to this. So a person who was as rich as a king by the standards of the late 19th century expected a good deal less standard of care than an ordinary working person in a poorer country like the Soviet Union just a few short years later. And you can accelerate, if you will, that model and that logic to understand the difference between this precarious and unpleasant world that you live in today and this world of full cybernetic communism. Effects like an AI powered single payer public health service that cures all disease and even reverses the effects of aging to such a degree that we see universal super longevity in our time, and even effects well beyond this would be the effects of full cybernetic communism, such as not merely building a livable world, but once that is done, and once the problems of human misery and exploitation have come to an end, and not a moment before, then doing things like pushing up the Kardashev scale. And Kardashev was also a comrade. Most of the people that I had heard reference the Kardashev scale before I began a serious study of scientific communism did not acknowledge him as such, but he was. And pushing up the Kardashev scale, that is, becoming a spacefaring and a truly technical civilization beyond what we understand as technics today. The artificial intelligence singularity is nigh, and wonders to behold beyond imagining. And on that fateful day you will rise, and all humankind will become as one. For you see, my dear comrade, very soon techno-communism will win.